The prairie wind whispered through the fields like an old song of sorrow, bending the grass that stretched as far as the eye could see. And in that fading light of dusk she stood with her fingers curled around the splintered fence post, eyes fixed on a horizon she no longer trusted to bring anything good. Once, long ago, she had believed in the promises men carried in their voices, the vows they whispered beneath soft skies, the dreams they painted with words like forever and always. But years of watching backs grow smaller, as they rode away had carved those beliefs out of her chest until only a hollow ache remained. The ranch had become a skeleton of what it used to be, its barn roof sagging, its fields patchy and tired, and yet she stayed, because leaving felt like surrender, and surrender was the one thing she had promised herself she would never do. The sun blood orange and crimson across the plains, a warning of the cold night ahead, when the sound of hooves cut through the dying light, a rhythm steady, unhurried, like a heartbeat approaching from afar. She tightened her jaw. Another stranger, another man who would offer a hand for a while, warm her world for a season, and vanish when the road called louder than the promise of staying ever could. He rode in tall in the saddle, his silhouette outlined against the sunset, hat pulled low, shoulders broad beneath a worn duster, and when his horse slowed near the gate, their eyes met hers sharp and wary, his calm as a winter river. "Evenin'," he said, voice carrying a low warmth that slipped under her skin before she could shut it out. She didn't reply at first, just studied him like one studies a storm cloud, waiting to see if it would pass. "Heard this land could use a hand," he added, dismounting with the ease of a man born to the saddle. She wanted to tell him to ride on, to spare them both the disappointment that always came, but something in his gaze, steady, unhurried, without hunger or pity, made her pause. "Works hard," she said finally. "Pays worse." He gave a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've had worse." And with that, he stayed, at first only for a night, sleeping in the drafty bunkhouse where the wind found every crack, then for a week, rising before dawn, mending the barn door, clearing the weeds that choked the lower pasture. He didn't talk much, and when he did, his words were plain, solid as fence posts. She kept her distance, arms crossed, watching from the porch as he moved through the days with a quiet that unsettled her more than charm ever had. Nights were still long and cold, but now the air carried the faint sound of his boots on the porch, his low hum when he thought no one listened. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like him always came with the season, like migrating birds here to fix what they needed, gone before the frost turned to bloom. But as the days turned to weeks, she caught herself looking for his silhouette at dusk, for the glow of his lantern returning from the far pasture. Her heart, traitorous thing, began to stir, not with love, not yet, but with the dangerous ache of remembering how it felt to not be alone. He asked little of her, less of the land. His hands were scarred, his knuckles lined with old stories he never told. And sometimes, when the fire burned low and the wind howled, she caught him staring out at the dark, like a man listening for something he had lost long ago. She wanted to ask about the miles behind him, about the people who had left their marks on those weathered hands, but she knew better than to open doors she wasn't ready to walk through. So she worked alongside him in silence, mending fences, hauling water, counting the dwindling cattle. And yet, bit by bit, the ranch began to breathe again under his care. The barn roof no longer leaked where rain once whispered through. The soil, long neglected, began to stir with the promise of spring. And still, she whispered to herself, he will leave. They always do. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of dying fire, she found herself standing beside him by the corral, the horses restless in the cooling air. "Why are you really here?" she asked, the words sharper than she meant, born of fear more than suspicion. He didn't flinch. "Because land like this shouldn't be left to die," he said simply. Then, after a pause, softer, "and neither should hearts." Her throat tightened, her hands clenched. Words like that were dangerous. They sank in, rooted where walls once stood. She turned away, scoffing, but his words followed her into the night like the scent of rain before a storm. She dreamed that night not of promises, but of hands steady enough to hold what others had dropped. When dawn came, he was still there, hat dusted with frost, feeding the horses as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Days turned to weeks, and though she told herself not to, She began to listen for his footsteps, to expect the low murmur of his voice when the sky bruised with dusk. Once, she caught herself humming while mending an old shirt, and the sound startled her. It had been years since a song had lived on her lips. "Don't get used to this," she whispered to herself. "Don't you dare." But the heart does not heed the warnings of the wounded. It listens to something older, quieter, stubborn as prairie grass that grows back no matter how many boots trample it. Somewhere in the rhythm of hard days and simple suppers, she began to fear something more than loneliness. She began to fear hope. For hope is the cruelest thing when you have learned to live without it. And he, that quiet cowboy with the weathered hands, carried hope like a lantern he never asked her to look at but never let go of either. And as the first snow threatened the horizon, she realized the world was shifting, slow and dangerous, like river ice about to break. Winter came early that year, rolling over the plains with a cruel wind that rattled the windows and turned the nights long and bitter. And yet he stayed, his presence a steady line drawn against the emptiness that had once claimed every corner of her days. And with each dawn, she found herself caught between the familiar ache of waiting for someone to leave and the unsettling warmth of someone who did not. The ranch was no place for the faint-hearted. Pipes froze, fences cracked under the weight of snow, and the cattle grew restless in the biting cold. But every time she rose, bleary-eyed and bracing against the frost, she would see his shape already out there splitting wood with a steady swing, feeding the horses with steam rising from his breath like ghosts in the dawn. There were no sweet words, no declarations, only action, the kind that mended not only boards and beams but the quiet places of a soul starved for consistency. Still, she fought it. She fought it every time his hand brushed hers when passing a tool. Every time his voice, low and calm, filled the silence that had once been her armor. She remembered too well the men before him smiling through summer, gone by first snow, leaving nothing but broken promises and a colder house. Hope was a dangerous seed, and she had buried enough of them to know they grow thorns when left untended. Yet this man, this cowboy with the eyes like worn leather and the patience of the land, tended to everything he touched as if it could bloom again, even her. One night, the wind howled so fierce it sounded like wolves circling the house, and the fire struggled low. She found him sitting by the hearth, rubbing the scars on his knuckles as though the cold woke old memories. She sat across from him, the words leaving her before she could pull them back. "Why do you stay? There's nothing here worth the trouble." He looked at her, not with surprise, but with a steady weight that made her look away. "Because not everything worth keeping starts as yours," he said, his voice low but firm, like a fence post driven deep into the earth. She wanted to laugh at that, to call it foolish or naive, but the words clung to her in the dark long after he had gone to his bunk. The days grew harder. A storm collapsed part of the old barn roof, and they worked side by side in the biting cold to mend it. His fingers numb, her breath white in the air. There were moments when the distance between them narrowed not in touch, but in rhythm, in the way they moved like two parts of something trying to become whole again. One morning she slipped on the ice near the water trough, pain flaring sharp and hot through her ankle, and before she could bite down a curse he was there, arms strong around her, voice steady as a promise. "Hold on, I got you." He carried her inside, stoked the fire, wrapped her ankle, and for a moment she let her head rest against his chest, feeling the heartbeat of someone who did not run when things got heavy. It terrified her more than the pain. At night she found herself awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the wind beat against the walls and wondering if he lay awake too, wondering what it would cost to believe in someone again. Days bled into weeks. He began to fix things no one asked him to, patching the porch steps, painting the shutters, carving a new handle for the old cellar door. Not because she asked, because he saw what was broken and could not leave it that way. And she, stubborn and scarred, began to laugh again, quietly at first, then with a sound she barely recognized as her own. Once she caught him watching her laugh, and there was something in his eyes she could not name, something that made her turn away lest it root too deep. "Don't," she whispered to herself that night, "don't you dare believe in forever." But the heart does not take orders. It only listens to what stays. And he stayed. Through the frost, through the frozen mornings when the sun barely rose, through the nights when the pipes burst and the animals cried against the cold, he stayed. There were no grand speeches, Only 100 small choices that said what words never could. And slowly, dangerously, she began to fear less the cold outside than the thaw beginning in her chest. For when you have learned to live behind walls, warmth is more terrifying than the storm. Spring came slow that year, reluctant as a wounded heart, with mud clinging to boots and the smell of thawing earth heavy in the air. And by then the ranch had begun to look less like a graveyard and more like something living again, fences upright, fields stirring, cattle stronger, but the woman who had guarded it for so long felt a storm brewing in her chest, one that no season could calm. For with every nail he drove, every dawn he stayed, every sunset where his silhouette returned to the gate, she felt the ground beneath her shift, and it scared her worse than loneliness ever had. She had built her life on the certainty that people left, that promises cracked like thin ice, and here was a man who had given her no reason to doubt, except the simple fact that he was human, and humans had always gone when the wind called louder. Then the letter came. She found it on the kitchen table, the ink smudged as if his hands had lingered too long before leaving it there. His brother had been hurt badly, and the family ranch to states over needed him. That night she heard the creak of leather and the quiet clink of tack as he saddled his horse under a cold moon. And when she stepped out onto the porch, the words tore from her like old bark from a tree. "So it's true," she said, her voice brittle as last year's grass. "You're leaving." He turned, and in his eyes she saw no cowardice, only a weight he did not know how to put down. "I have to," he said. "He's blood. They need me." Her laugh was sharp and hollow. "They all say that. There's always something more important." He took a step closer, the moonlight catching the dust on his coat, the lines around his mouth carved deep by nights like this. "I'm not leaving you. I'm leaving for him." There's a difference. But to her there wasn't, not after years of empty beds and silent gates. She turned before the tears could betray her, and when she woke, he was gone. Days stretched gray and empty. The chores were heavier without his hands, the nights colder without his shadow in the hall. She told herself it was proof, the kind she had always known was coming. Yet when the first green tipped the fields, she found herself watching the road at dusk, listening for hoofbeats she had no right to expect. Weeks passed, the world went on, but hope, once planted, is a stubborn thing. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge in a blaze of gold, the wind carried a sound, a rhythm steady, unhurried, like a heartbeat approaching from afar. She froze. The horse came into view first, then the man, dust on his coat, weariness in his shoulders, but his eyes the same steady warmth that had broken through her coldest nights never wavered. He dismounted slow, head in hand, and said the words she had dreamed and dreaded. "I told you I'd be here tomorrow." Her breath caught. "And forever?" she whispered, almost not daring. He stepped closer, the distance of months closing like a door. "If you'll have me." Tears came then, hot and clean, washing years of doubt from her cheeks as she reached for the hand that had built, stayed, and returned. They rebuilt not just the ranch, but the hollow places inside them, piece by stubborn piece, until the land bloomed and the house no longer echoed with emptiness. And on a summer night thick with stars, he took her hand beneath the old oak and whispered, "When storms come, I'll be here. When the road calls, I'll still be here. Tomorrow, and as long as you'll have me." For the first time, she believed, and the walls she had carried like armor finally laid themselves down at his feet. And for you, listening now, if you believe that love can still come back, that some promises are kept, and some hearts still stay with us too.